I was born in Australia, and when I was 4 we moved to Calgary, my family, and then in my early 20s I pilgrimaged to Toronto, ended up staying here for 6 years, then moving to Montreal, so getting the English and Francophone new music experience, and then I moved to Los Angeles about 12-13 years ago, where I've been based ever since. When I was about 7 or 8, I remember going into a music store, getting my Royal Conservatory of Music book, and the woman in there knew me, so she had these little 45 records that were portraits of Canadian composers. And she gave me a whole bunch of these, and I brought them home and I listened to them. And I didn't understand the music at that point, but I was completely fascinated by it. So I think by listening to that sort of music and growing up in that community that has that, you can't help but not be influenced by it. There were two things that happened sort of very close together in time many years ago. One, I was introduced to the poetry of Akiko Yosano, who is a Japanese poet, obviously read it in English translation. Her poetry is mostly of the form of a tanka, which is an expanded haiku essentially, and it has a very specific syllabic rhyme. And these poems were from sort of a new school of tanka, where things were much more obviously stated. Even in today's Japanese society, her poems are considered, very erotic and risque, whereas to our sensibilities, they just are very beautiful descriptions of love and love relationships. The other thing I found at the same time was a book called The Emperor of Scent, and it was basically about a gentleman, Luca Turin, who's a chemist, scientist, who started exploring the idea of smell. He was originally in the perfume industry, and the accepted theory of smell is that your nasal passages, whatever, recognize the shape, molecular shape of something. In fact, it's the frequency of the molecule rather than the shape of the molecule that gives the identity to the person and identifies the particular smell. He found something that had two molecules of different shapes, or the same shape but different frequencies. And anyway, I don't think he's very accepted in terms of the scientific community. But nonetheless, this sort of really sparked my imagination, because if you think of music, it's a waveform. If you think of visual stimulus, it's a waveform. And I thought, my God, if you could do smell too. It's sort of one of those crazy scratch and sniff moments. I ended up getting the smell spectrum for rose geranium. And I mapped this on an XY graph and got basically pitch content that started off the basic pitches for the entire piece. What turned out to be kind of interesting is that the tankas, I found out, going back to the tankas, they were originally not spoken. They were in court, they were actually sung with a koto, and of course a koto is tuned to a sort of a pentatonic scale. So the pentatonic scale and the spectrum for my rose geranium were quite similar, so that was an interesting correlation. The tankas I selected from her collection I thought should have some kind of narrative form to it. Most of them deal with love, and I thought, well, maybe I could do something that deals with sort of some kind of love relationship or an affair. The poems are grouped in such a way that it's sort of the beginning of a relationship where someone's attracted and it's all interesting. Then there's the actual sort of excitement of the affair. Then it's finished. And after it's finished, there is anger. Maybe then there's despair. And then the final poem I selected was one of remembrance, sort of fond memories, after the fact of years past or the affair past. So I thought that was a really interesting trajectory, and there turned out to be 7 pieces. That it's all sort of within one larger work. Also in the piece, the idea of 7 keeps coming back. So there are 7 movements. The idea of 7 in symbolism refers to something that's a completion. It's, the 4 plus the 3, you've got the week, all of that sort of idea. In one of the movements, you have these gestures that grow in the string parts, obviously, since it's a string quartet, and the 7th one comes back in the 7th movement. So there's this sort of numerical play in the actual piece. It's sort of on a macro and a micro structure. Being Canadian, my ties with Canada are with a number of really amazing musicians. Some of the musicians in Motion Ensemble, the Penderecki String Quartet, I've worked with Ergo projects, and they're all such passionate people and really inspiring in terms of what they're doing and what they want to involve you in doing. It's been this really interesting path through very different musical landscapes, I have to say, and each of them I've sort of picked up inspirations from or teachings. Obviously, as a student at University of Toronto and at McGill, the faculty there, all of them were just so amazing. You know, when you're a student, you just learn so much. It's not until later years that you realize what they've actually given you, musical gift.